Hey there, I'm Ari from the Tech Bars Guru, and I've got a very special video for you here on the channel today. I'm going to show you how I built this 4x4 Baja Bug RC vehicle. Now, I am a PC and smart home tech reviewer. If you've watched the channel, you know that I do a lot of product reviews, and occasionally I will throw together an RC video, although I'm not an RC reviewer. This is my hobby, this is what I do for fun, and I like to share it with my audience because I think there's a lot of overlap between people who might be interested in smart home or PC tech and RC vehicles. Now, if you're new to the hobby, you may think of these as toys, but actually this is a hobby grade product, and it's actually a pretty high-tech piece of machinery. Now, this whole process of building this Baja Bug took me about 8 hours. I have narrowed it down to about 30 minutes of video. I do focus in on the trouble spots and the challenging areas, so if this is a vehicle that you've just purchased or you have sitting waiting to build, you may want to watch the video from start to finish because I do go over a lot of the trouble areas where I think Proline may not have completely covered all of the details in the manual. And so I think it will really help you folks out there who have this in your hands, but really anyone who's interested in the RC hobby. You might want to watch the whole video from start to finish. If you just want to see the end results, to see how this Baja Bug runs outside, well, you can skip to the end and I'll give you a teaser of that, and I'll probably be following up this video with another video showing this in more outdoor action. So without further ado, let's break open this box and see what we get inside. Now, I should note that being a kit means that a lot of the parts actually aren't included. This harkens back to the days of old when people really had to research their hobby. Before the internet even existed, people went to hobby shops and asked all sorts of questions, asked their friends all sorts of questions. Maybe went to a track and asked questions, said, what do I need to build up this system? Well, that's kind of the same thing we have here, and I'm going to kind of give you a short introduction and tutorial on what it means to go research your own parts. So, what do you get in the box with this kit? Well, you get a bunch of bags. I also get this manual here that's going to tell me how to put these pieces together. But what you don't get in this kit is a whole lot of really important components, like the tires. These are Proline trencher tires, which I may choose to use on this kit, although I have some others that I might try out as well. And ultimately, I'm just going to choose the ones that I think perform the best or look the best. I also have a Proline Baja Buggy body. Now, I painted this up myself. These come clear plastic, and part of the fun is learning how to paint them. I spent a lot of time on this paint job. And then, of course, it's the electronics. Proline does not manufacture any electronics, and they don't give you any electronics. I'm going to be going with 3 different brands that I really trust. On the transmitter and receiver side, I'm using a Futaba 3PV radio and a Futaba R204 receiver. Very small, very, very high powered, extremely long range. For the propulsion system, I'm going with Castle Creations, a great company based in Kansas. They make their own electronic speed controls, which is what this little black box is. That's what kind of tells your vehicle if it's going forward or reverse or braking. It controls your motor. These are actually hand built in Kansas, which is quite amazing. It's attached to a Castle Creations 1415 series motor. This is a 2400 kV motor, which is a rating of its power output. You can see I already have these connected. I had to do a little soldering to make this all happen. And if you've never used a soldering iron, well, I'm not an expert on that. I'm not going to give you any tutorials on that. Go find that somewhere else on YouTube. Last electronic component I have is the servo. This is a great compact servo from ProTech RC. This is a brand from A-Main Hobbies, a great store. Check them out. So I will be back soon with something in front of me that starts to resemble a vehicle, hopefully. So catch you then. All right, so I've got all my parts laid out on the table in bags. I have my manual out, and I'm just going to point out a couple things. First of all, you do need quite a few different tools that are not included, like hex drivers, nut drivers, side cutters, servo type thread lock. I'm surprised that Proline doesn't include thread lock. I should say one really indispensable tool here is a set of hex wrenches. This is an Associated or a factory team kit from Associated, and it's got a bunch of tools inside it. This model actually isn't sold anymore, which is just fine because this has some SAE hex heads, which are really not of any use today in modern models. So Associated actually sells a newer version of this tool with all metric hardware, and that's what you're going to want. Now, like a lot of kits, this actually starts with the differentials. And what's nice is that you can see you have an actual size legend on the side here. So you can easily match up, like if there's different O-rings, you know which O-ring to use. You also have an indication of which bag you'll find the parts in. So I found that very helpful, and I noticed, for instance, that all these are in bag A. That's nice, that I don't have to, say, get the shims in bag A and maybe the bearings in bag B or something like that. I'm going to just highlight this issue right here, and that is the what they're using inside the differentials. In the center diff, they have 500,000 weight oil, which makes a lot of sense. In the front and rear diffs, they just have black grease, and that, frankly, doesn't make a ton of sense. I'm a little bit surprised that they didn't provide something other than black grease, which is just a lubricant. It doesn't actually provide any resistance inside the differential, and that means you can diff out, which means one tire will just start taking all the torque, and that's the tire with the least amount of traction. So I'm actually not even going to follow this instruction. I'm going to provide my own oil, and I'm probably going to use something like 10,000 weight oil. Okay, so I've got bag A open here. Let's see what we got. Well, I can tell there's a whole lot of parts in here, not all of which are going to be used on this step, the differential assembly. For instance, this is the tire wrench. I don't think I'm going to need that for quite some time. We've got gears, bearings. Here's the grease and the differential oil, I'm assuming. It is also leaking, which is not super great. Okay, so that's first thing first, this has leaked all over the place, which is kind of gross. I've got some parts on parts trees. Of course, whenever you're building an RC car or truck, you're going to have parts trees. And the best way to get these off is with an X-Acto knife, so you don't leave any plastic bits hanging on them. Okay, the very first step was to create the center diff and fill it with 500,000 weight oil that was included. And that 500,000 weight oil, which I've gotten inside here, has the consistency of peanut butter. And honestly, Proline really goofed up not putting that in a squeezable tube, but rather just in a little jar, which just made it super, super hard to use. So kind of a point off for that, but I think I've got this, so I'm going to close it up. Now, just as an example, I'm going to show you this diff oil that I'm using, 30,000 weight I'm going to use in the front diff. And this comes in a squeeze bottle. This is from Traxxas. And I actually highly recommend that you pick up some of this or another brand of diff oil that is squeezable. And in particular, because the kit doesn't include any diff oil for the front or rear diff, you basically need some. So you can see how easy this is to squeeze. You still need to let it settle into the gears, but it isn't nearly as hard to apply as something that comes in a jar. Now I've got that front diff ready to go. Checking the action, it's smooth, and I'm ready to attach the bevel gear, which I'll show you right here. And this bolts it all together and gets it ready to be inserted in the truck. Just a quick tip here, as I build the rear diff, I used 10,000 weight diff lube in this diff. So that's 30,000 in the front and 10,000 in the rear. Now I'm on to the next step, which is to start building the chassis. And I just wanted to mention one thing I found. Basically, it comes with a carbon steel bar, which is a reinforcement for the 3mm chassis. I believe it's 3mm. The steel bar, of course, is reinforcement because it bends less than aluminum does. But it wasn't actually perfectly straight, and I really had to jam it in here to get it in. And once it's in, I can't pop it out because it's actually under tension here, because the bar itself was just ever so slightly curved. You can almost see that here. It's not perfectly straight. You can see that right here, actually. There's like a little bump here. So that was a little odd, but I was able to get it in. But I'm a little concerned if their manufacturing tolerances are far enough off that some of these bars just wouldn't be able to fit in this cutout. But I'm going to go ahead and install the diffs and then come back to you. All right, I'm just going to stop to mention something, which is that you get a lot of parts trees like this. And what's interesting about the way Proline has done it here is that you don't actually get any sort of numbering on here. So you actually just have to go by the picture, which is a little bit confusing. I've never actually seen that before, where you'd get a parts tree with all these little shims and plastic pieces that kind of look alike but aren't the same, and they have no numbers on them whatsoever. You just kind of have to go by looking at it and kind of thinking about what the part's for. I'm a little surprised by that. Other thing that I should mention is that often you have like a right and a left you have to do, but they don't actually show you both sides. So that can, it's a little bit, you can get a little disoriented if all they show you, like what I'm looking at here, right here in the manual. This is the, I don't even know, I guess that's the left side, and they say do left and right, but they don't show both sides. So that can be a little disorienting if you're not kind of familiar with how a truck goes together. I feel like this is a kit that was made kind of after the fact, and the original version, the Pro MT, was pre-built, and that, you know, the instructions they put together here are not quite complete. All right, a few more observations for you now that I've assembled the front end assembly here. First of all, there is a heavy-duty outdrive clip, which is this right here. Now, to actually install that, you need a special tool that's not included in the kit, and probably most people won't even have. It's called a snap ring pliers, and I actually have one on order, so I'm going to be installing this piece a little bit later. And it goes right here. And right now there's just kind of a little, it's really not much more than like a paper clip that's on here. In fact, when I put it on and then took it off, it bent out of shape, and now it barely holds on. So this outdrive can fall out or become very loose, and it's what actually makes contact with the differential ring inside. So you don't want this moving around, and right now that clip on there is not really holding it very well. So I will be changing that out. Another thing is that it says in terms of the pillow ball suspension, which is what this is called, okay, you've got like a little metal ball in there, and it acts both for your steering pivot as well as for your suspension pivots, right? So it's pretty effective because it can move in both directions. But the instructions just say don't over tighten. That's kind of like a subjective thing, right? And they don't give any clues as to what that means. Luckily, I've had a lot of experience with other models that use a pillow ball system, and my approach in terms of tightening these up is that you want it tight enough that you don't have movement from side to side. Okay, so I don't have any play in this direction, but I have it just loose enough that it doesn't bind the steering or the suspension. And I had to really test that at each step, right? So I tested it even before I had it connected to my suspension arms. I would just kind of move the pillow ball up and down to test, well, is it going in and out? Is there play? Is it jamming? Can I easily move it with my fingers without any friction on it? And there's just really one level of tightness. You got to get it just right on here. Just a millimeter too tight and it's going to start binding, and you don't want that. And the last thing I'm going to say, and I think this is a little bit odd, is that at no point in the assembly of the drivetrain does Proline say that you should lubricate anything. And I think that is just a complete oversight in the manual. It didn't say to apply any grease to the differential rings, the suspension pivots, the universal drive shafts in here. So remember, Proline actually didn't say to put any grease in here, and I think that's just insane. It's just insane that you'd have no lube in your diff, and I don't understand how that's possible that they forgot to put that in the manual. Okay, I'm going to move on to the steering assembly, which I have pictured right here, and then I'll be attaching this to the chassis, which is going to be exciting. It's going to start looking like a vehicle soon enough. Okay, I'll be back shortly. So I'm about to attach the steering rack to the chassis, and we have another example of where Proline has kind of just skipped any instruction here as to what parts they're referring to. There are these tiny parts shown in the manual that assemble into the chassis. Actually, they go into the bottom of the chassis, and then they sit right here in these two indents here and here on the other side. And they just show these pieces and they give no indication of where they are. This step of the instruction is actually related to bag D, and yet I know, because I saw these pieces earlier and wondered what they were for, these pieces are in bag B. And there's no indication at all in this step. This is step number 14, where you're going to find these pieces or what they are, if they're metal or plastic, if they're in a bag or on a parts tree. It's on a parts tree. This is the kind of thing that if this kit were directed at people who had not really assembled vehicles before, it'd be a big problem. I'm just going to show you a couple other things here. Here I have assembled the steering rack, testing that it is running smoothly. Here I have attached the front bulkhead. I'm just showing you that tiny little stub shaft. It's a little bit hard to get in there because it's so small. And I will secure the front bulkhead to the chassis. And then I will show you that all assembled. And I'm just going to check everything, make sure I've got good movement on my steering, on my pivot balls, on my suspension arms. Before I start attaching all the other components, I want to make sure that's all running smoothly. Don't forget that you will need some thread lock, and it's not included with the kit. Anytime you're screwing metal into metal, you need to use thread lock to secure it. Another quick tip when you're assembling the turnbuckles, make sure you realize that one side screws in clockwise and the other one is counterclockwise. So that's not mentioned in the manual, but anyone who's worked with turnbuckles before would know that these turnbuckles, on one side of them doesn't thread in normally, it threads in reverse. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this and finish up my steering rack. So I just wanted to stop at this point where I have, this is the rear end of the chassis and the rear gearbox, and I wanted to show how you attach or actually install what's called the optional HD outdrive clip. It's this tiny little clip here. You need a special tool to install it. Okay, so there's the tool, there's the clip. You can't use a regular pliers, you need what's called a snap rings plier. So I did get this gear wrench set. You don't need all 4 of these, but it came in as a set, so I picked it up like that. What this does is it allows you to open up that snap ring just enough to get it around your outdrive here, okay? So the standard part that it comes with is this tiny little clip here that looks like a paper clip and kind of has the strength of a paper clip. Get yourself a pair of these. Here's how it goes on. I'm going to show you. The pliers, as you grip the pliers, it actually spreads open that clip and allows you to clip it on, and then you let go of it, and ideally it's on. It's that simple. Now I'm going to move along in the assembly of the truck. I've attached the rear bulkhead and I'm just securing the suspension arms at this point. Right at this point I have actually built 3 of the shock bodies so far. I want to tell you that I'm wearing this blue glove because I found myself actually getting cut while I was holding these shock bodies. So the threads are actually fairly sharp. So I basically got the equivalent of paper cuts on my finger. So that's why I'm wearing that glove there. So I'm going to show you the assembly of the last of the 4 shock bodies. First of all, note that there are 2 different lengths. So this one is for the rear shock. That means I'll have to make sure that I get the right shock shaft set up with it. You can see here's 2 different length shock shafts. So obviously the longer one goes with the longer body. So right now I'm going to be building the shock collar up at the top. These pieces don't need to be completely smooth because they're not actually moving. They just serve to hold the actual washer in place. This is a blue rubber washer that the shaft will go through. These go inside, go like that. That goes in there. I'll just tap it in with the shock shaft. That's more or less flat. Then we'll do the actual rubber washer. Be careful with that. It can tear. Then the other plastic insert that holds it in place. And then the rubber O-ring around the outside there. Screw that on. Now I'm going to show you the assembly of the pistons. And the trick for these is that you're going to need a 5mm wrench for these tiny little M2.5 lock nuts. So I had that from a different kit. And then the tricky part is the actual piston is a different size for the front and rear. So it says here use the 6-hole by 1.4mm for the front and the 6-hole by 1.6mm for the rear. These aren't labeled. That's one of the problems with this kit. You just actually have to look at it and decide which of these has the bigger hole. When you're talking about 0.2 of a millimeter, they don't make it very easy for you, do they? But it does look smaller. Now this piston, this is going to be going up and down inside the shock shaft, so I want to trim off all this extra plastic here with my X-Acto knife and make it as smooth as possible. So then we put these on the piston, and here's the tricky part. I have this tiny little lock nut. I cannot tighten this by hand because it is a lock nut. That means there is some resistance on here. So the way I've done it is I use my little wrench, my box wrench, and I hold the other side with a needle nose pliers. I don't want to score the shaft at all. So I hold it by the threaded section, and I'm not turning it there. I'm just turning the box wrench here to tighten that nut onto the shaft. Now the next step is, I'm going to turn the page, shock assembly. So they mentioned that to avoid damage to the X-ring, which is the washer that's inside of here, you have to apply a small amount of shock oil to the shaft before you insert it. This actually comes with the kit, 60 weight shock oil. I'm going to put a tiny bit of shock oil on the threads here, and that's just because this is going through a rubber gasket. So there we go. So the next step is a little bit tricky. These have to be cut off and then threaded on, and it's always quite challenging. The trick that they suggest is actually to hold on basically to the bottom of this with your box wrench, right? So that's holding on the shaft, and then I just turn this in on place. It's still hard to get it started. That's the challenge here. This still isn't a super fun process, but since I'm holding the threaded lock nut at the other side, I don't have to worry about the shaft spinning as I do this. Then I have what they call the lower shock pivot ball. There we go. That's in. I got to fill this with oil. I also have these, the shock bladder goes into a shock cap. So let's do this one by one. With shock shaft fully extended, fill to within 2mm of the top. So I think that's pretty good. Then slowly move the shaft up and down to work the bubbles out. It's got a little bit of oil coming out of here, so I'm just going to clean that off. But better have too much oil in there than too little, because that means your shock is full. So I'm going to get this, I'm going to try one more time, get this threaded on here. There we go. I can feel it now. Now I can actually just go ahead and put on the spring, test that motion's pretty smooth, feels good. Get the longer spring on there, and then the spring retainer, and it's going to be done. So there you go. Assembly of a Proline shock for the Profusion SC 4x4. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and show you how you attach the shock to the truck. Proline does not really call out in the instructions where you would find the shock mount here. It's on one of the plastic trees, of course. It's not labeled. I just had to kind of seek it out. So this is the last of the 4. All right, so I take my 30mm screw, thread it through that washer there, put it through the shock mount. Then here's the shock mounting post. I've got to screw it in because it's got some friction. I'll go ahead and do that now. You want to make sure that you don't get this lock nut, the last of these lock nuts, which is right here. You don't want it too tight because it'll actually prevent the shock from moving freely like this. Okay, so now I have some freedom of motion there. And Push that through. There we go. Now all I have to do is lock it down with the set screw. All right, as you can see, the chassis is now complete. All I have to do is install the electronics, which is a big deal, but that stuff is basically everything that doesn't come with the kit. So the kit, as we see it here, is just about done. So I actually wasn't going to film this, the installation of the battery rail here, but then I found another problem. Basically in the design of this, you just have to rely on the plastic to hold that nut in place. And what I found was that it basically stripped out the plastic rail unless I pre-threaded these outside of the truck. So I've now pre-threaded this through that lock nut so that the lock nut has less resistance. I'm going to attempt to screw it into place. All right, now I'm going to be attaching the servo to the servo mount here. You can see I've got the mount in place. My servo actually comes with nice metal washers, so I'm not using the washers that come with the kit. What's nice with when you use a metal bodied servo like mine, you don't crush the flanges here, which you could with other types of servos. All right, next step is attaching the servo to the chassis. It's kind of a little awkward. You feed that wire through right here. There's my wire. There's the wire and there's the center diff. I'll have to pay attention to it later when I wire it up, make sure it's not getting hit by the center diff. Now I'm going to go ahead and attach my servo using my 2.5mm driver here. I'll go around, make sure that it's evenly set. Screw it into plastic here, so I don't want to go too hard. Well, I've got a servo horn already, which came with my servo. It's a lot better than the plastic stuff that you get. These are probably going to strip out. This is the equivalent that I could have used, but didn't want to use that one. But I do need to use a servo link. That's this right here, and I'll build that up in a second. So here's another really annoying step here. The servo arm here goes through here, and then you need to feed a lock nut in on the other side where you have basically no access. I gotta get a lock nut right in there where my finger is pointing. And I have to kind of put something in there to press up against that lock nut so I can grab it. There, it's locked in now. The last step I can't actually finish until I've got my battery in and my radio connected. You have to set the distances here. When your wheels are at neutral, you want your servo to be at neutral, which I'm not at right now. So, let's see if I can. I'm going to approximate it now, because you can't do this step until your truck's done. All right, now I'm going to be installing the motor on the mount. Technically, I'm using a 550 can motor as opposed to a 1/8 scale motor. So I use the smaller of the screws that are included. There's a thicker diameter screw that you'd use with a 1/8 scale motor. I'm not using that, although my motor is a pretty powerful 550 size motor, so it bridges the gap. It's quite a long can, but because it's still 550 size in terms of diameter, I actually need to use this little adapter piece that comes on this plastic tree, and that's kind of a reducer and ensures that the motor is well supported on here. So I put that on here, use these tiny screws to attach it. I gotta use the correct mounting hole. The spacing here should be wider than the spacing between those two screws. Motor looks well supported, right? Sitting nicely on that plastic insert there. So I think we're ready to install it in the chassis. This truck uses these spacers to set your gear mesh, which is actually nice if you're new to setting gear mesh, but it does mean you kind of have to keep these around, which is a little bit of a pain. I'm going to just go ahead and use the standard, for now, the 16 tooth pinion that it comes with. And it says here that 16 tooth is the spacer with 2 dots. Now, the way you position them here is with the hole inboard, because you want the motor a little bit closer than you would with a 19 tooth pinion, which is the other position for this spacer. Now I'll go ahead and bolt these down. The very last step is to secure your electronics to the chassis. You need to use servo tape for that, which is not included. And you'll put some on the receiver, which goes up in front of the motor, and then some on the bottom of your speed control, which of course goes behind the motor. I'm going to finish that up and then show you this truck in action. All right, one last thing I should mention before I show you this truck running is that I did need an accessory to mount the body. That is the Proline body mount. These are the extended body mounts. This is part 607001, and they actually say that you need the full body mount kit, but this is like the replacement kit, and this is actually all you need, because all you need is the extended body mount that is back here. Actually, for this kit, you need that extended body post for just about all of the truck bodies, so not just the Baja Bug, but some of the other pickup trucks as well. So I'm going to show you this truck running. Got my Futaba radio here. I'm going to turn it on, and away we go. Want to see more? Comment down below, thumbs up, and I'll catch you next time.